Hi everyone, welcome back to our afternoon, morning, or evening, depending where you're connecting from together. We are at the second day of our FTxSDG challenge by Financial Times and the Seedstars. This is another part for you to be inspired by our experts and speakers to know more about the SDG topic. We are going to analyze the fifth topic of the week, and it's really interesting, this one. I know that you have been really eager to listen to this panel because we're going to be discussing the goal number 10, reduce the inequalities. And what do we mean? What are we discussing here? It's all about many different angles. We can take, of course, inequalities as we have seen since yesterday in so many different spins. But what I think is really important is here quoting the UN report saying income inequality is on the rise. The richest 10% have up to 40% of global income, whereas the poorest 10% earn only between 2 to 7%. If we take into account population growth inequality in developing countries, inequality has increased by 11%. Of course, when we talk about income inequality, we can, of course, take it from different countries' angles. So it has increased definitely everywhere, but at different speeds. What we have seen is definitely that the lowest increase is in Europe and the highest is in the Middle East. This panel, of course, because of the so many different shadows and that we can give it to the talk, is doing a bit of more interesting depth analysis into technology and how can technology reshape the economy and close gaps in incomes, opportunities, and justice needs. So what are the mechanisms also organizations could use to help support the efforts of entrepreneurs to reduce inequalities? How can we harness the positive benefits of migration and reduce the vulnerability of migrants, thereby reducing then the pressure for irregular, dangerous migration routes? And so we're going to get two angles here, technology and also migration. And of course, the third one, not to forget, entrepreneurs, because this is for you guys. This is for the SDG challenge attendees and audience that we know that has been so interested in working on their entrepreneurial ideas and startup ideas, and as well use their entrepreneurial spirit to try to tackle this issue. I'm not going to do this by myself at all. I'm just going to moderate the talk because the experts that are going to listen to today are Dr. Lara Srivastava, that I see here connected. Hello, Lara. Very nice to seeing you.
Hi,
Then we have Sandra Boulous, Program Manager from the Swiss Agency for Development and Cooperation, and Alex Irwin Hunt is our Global Markets Editor, FTi Intelligence, a specialist publication at the Financial Times. So thank you so much to the three amazing speakers that we have today for joining me. And the first question is going to be a bit general, and I did not introduce the first one that I'm going to ask this question to properly because I'm going to read a bit of a bio of each of the speakers before doing so. The first question is all about reduced inequalities and what do we mean by that. To do so, Dr. Lara Srivastava, our digital development consultant at the World Bank, that is a policy advisor, lawyer, futurist, and strategic foresight expert with over 25 years of experience working for and advising governments, industry, internet startups, and international organizations, will help us frame this first question. Lara, over to you, and then we'll go to Sandra and Alex. Thank you.
Virginia, thank you very much. And hello, everybody. It's a real pleasure to be here. Thank you very much to the organizers for inviting me. What a first question. How do we define this? What do we mean when we talk about reduced inequalities? Well, first of all, I think I want to start by saying, and this has been said by many, that inequality is one of, if not, the biggest threat to our society and our planet and our well-being. And it's not just one inequality, it's multiple inequalities, and they all intersect. So the fundamental idea is, of course, that every person in the world, no matter where they live or how old they are, or what they look like, or whom they love, what they believe in, should be able to live in dignity and have minimum living standards. Now, that might sound, doesn't really sound revolutionary, right? But unfortunately, this is just not how we've managed to structure our world. And that's because the resources in our world are unevenly distributed. whether that's in terms of wealth as an income, as Virginia mentioned, or nutrition or education. And progress is also coming, is unevenly distributed. So there's a chasm, there's a huge chasm between those that have a lot, those that have very little. We know the statistics, top 1% own more than 50% of the world's wealth. We know that women in rural communities are more likely to die in childbirth. We know that billions are living on less than a couple of dollars a day. And this inequality is a vicious cycle that repeats itself. It gets reinforced across generations. Much of your life is determined by the circumstances of your birth. If you were born with very well-off parents, you're likely to be well off. If your parents were born in poverty, you're likely to live in poverty. And we're not just talking about wealth here or resources, right? It's also about the distribution of power in society. Many groups of people, be it racial minorities and indigenous populations, refugees, migrants, women, suffer a lot of discrimination, whether it's in terms of employment or wages, access to opportunities, access to justice that can improve their lives. And they're also being excluded from decision-making, public policy decision-making, corporate decision-making. Look at the statistics on the number of women in boards, right? And the pandemic, of course, has reminded us of just how fragile our world is, just how interconnected and interdependent. We saw those that have very little, as I mentioned before, suffer the most. The poorer countries suffer more than the rich countries. Even for access to life-saving medication, vaccines, which frankly would be a win-win, right? And it was Gandhi that said that we can judge a civilization by how we treat its most vulnerable. And I'm not sure, we've made progress, but I'm not sure we're scoring really well on that front. And I think that's why we desperately need the big ideas in this room. Out there, the sort of impact-driven entrepreneurs and entrepreneurial spirit that are gathered in here today in this FT Seedstars challenge, so that we can understand and we can, so that they can help us better structure our world for everyone, everywhere.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Lara. And maybe you want to give your perspective, Sandra, as well on this question. And let me just introduce yourself as well. Sandra is a development professional with experience in Egypt, Albania, and on Syria and Turkey. So since 2015, she has been at the Swiss Agency for Development and Cooperation, the SDC, that you see in her name now, at the Federal Department of Foreign Affairs. She has expertise in governance, humanitarian aid, gender, and migration. Currently, she is a program manager on migration and development for the SDC, and you're working on global migration dialogue as well as on the remittances and the financial inclusion of migrants. So maybe you want to elaborate a bit, thanks to your experience, on maybe the migration point. Thank you so much, Sandra.
Thanks a lot, Virginia. Yeah, let me take this question from the migration perspective. And Lara did the job of showing the overarching framework when we speak of inequalities. And when we speak of inequalities, we often also speak about, we look at particular population groups and who has power and who doesn't have power. And for example, in the Sustainable Development Goals, we also speak of the importance of leaving no one behind. So from our perspective in my program, we look at migrants and forcibly displaced people because often they're also among the particularly vulnerable population. So often badly paid, discriminated against, exploited, etc. So when we look at migration and inequalities, what we look at, we look at it from two angles. We look on the one hand of how can migration actually contribute to the sustainable development of countries of origin and countries of destination. And that sounds a bit vague overall, but if we look at it concretely, we know that nowadays there are around 280 million international migrants. And these migrants bring skills, they bring investments, they bring new ideas to their countries of destination, and they also fill gaps in the labor market. And these migrants also, men and women, they also send considerable parts of their salaries, the so-called remittances, they send them back also to their families at home, and they use it for food, for access to education, to go to the hospital, etc. So in that sense, we want to also unleash this positive aspect of migration for the sustainable development. And on the other hand, we're also aware there can be negative effects of especially also irregular migration. And that's why we also want to address root causes of forced displacement. We want to prevent conflict. We also don't want to create brain drains in countries of origin so that suddenly there is a complete loss of skilled workers. So in that sense, when we speak of reducing inequalities, we always speak about these two aspects of trying to look at the positive aspects of migration for development, and on the other hand, also look how we can reduce the negative impacts it might have.
Thank you very much, Sandra. And now I'll ask to my fellow colleague, Alex, to elaborate a bit more, maybe from his perspective, because what Alex is doing for FTi Intelligence, that is the specialist publication at the FT, that is focusing on foreign investment and economic development, is really reporting on the latest trends in cross-border investments, writing features about themes shaping investment decisions across industries, and producing reports on investment destinations worldwide. So based also on your recently launched podcast, Rising Ecosystems, that you're really exploring as well emerging technologies and trends, how you would elaborate from your point of view the definition of reduced inequalities? Thanks, Alex.
Well, thank you very much, Virginia. And I have to say, Lara and Sandra have already covered the point very, very well. So I'll keep my comments rather brief. As you say, I mean, I'm looking a lot into terms of the economic development perspective. And I would cite actually a bit of reading that maybe our audience members might want to look into. It's almost a decade old now, but there's a fantastic book called Spirit Level, Why Equality is Better for Everyone by two UK academics, Richard Wilkinson and Kate Pickett. And this really looks at, the issue is not just economic inequality in terms of income, pay and wealth. Actually, when you look at trends across countries, more unequal countries perform worse on lots of different social metrics, many of which have already been mentioned by my fellow panelists, such as mental health, life expectancy, violence, illiteracy. And so really the point is for me, in terms of foreign investment attraction, this can create opportunities, has a potential to perhaps reduce inequalities and reduce some of those social ills that you see in more unequal societies. So I'll keep it brief in that sense, but this is also where technology can come in terms of really providing access and opportunity, which then in turn reduce inequality.
Thank you very much, Alex, and we'll definitely send your book recommendations over on the chat right now. So second question for you all, how can technology, because we said that we are going to give a bit of a spin to the discussion all around a bit tech. So how can technology be helping us bridge the gap to reduce inequalities? And of course, how can we even empower then entrepreneurs in the tech industry to help us bridging the gap? Lara.
Well, thanks, Virginia. I think there's a lot to say here in a few minutes. So I've been working mainly in tech in the regulatory aspects and technology foresight aspects. And what we have, of course, observed is that with any technological advance comes a lot of progress, a lot of opportunity, but also a different set of risks and threats coming about from that technology. So before I embark on talking about how technology can reduce inequalities, I think I have to make a caveat here, a very important one, that despite the tremendous potential that technology does afford us in this area, it's not a panacea to the world's problems. It's also not a panacea to even any one problem, right? And not only that, but if we don't carefully design and roll out technology, and technology just for technology's sake can create quite a number of risks, like the ones we've seen: privacy violations, disinformation, greater social exclusion, even bias from new developments in AI and algorithms. But that being said, there's a lot to be gained in terms of how technology can close gaps that currently exist across a number of sectors. I'm going to talk maybe about a couple. Let's take education, for starters. Education lies at the heart, of social progress. Technology in that regard can be a great equalizer. It can bridge gender divides, urban-rural divides, poverty divides. I think one of the panelists in a previous session talked about that. With a simple internet-enabled device, people in remote communities can access the latest tech, the latest know-how from any part of the world. So in theory, a student in a remote part of Madagascar could access courses from University of London or Boston or Harvard. And last year, we know that a lot of children were left out of school due to the pandemic. I think it was 1.6 billion students and children. And already, even before, there were 250 million or so students out of school. So there's a lot of impact, or a lot of scope here for impact work. For example, in areas such as mobile learning, peer-to-peer learning, virtual tutoring, content platforms that can improve the skills, the skilling, and the learning outcomes, and really create opportunities for so many, and for so many across generations, right? Because I mean, education for me is really key to solving broader equality issues. And I say this, and if I may, Virginia, talk from a personal perspective.
Of course, please.
So I say this from personal experience. My grandmother, who helped raise me, she's like a second mom to me. She was actually a child bride. So she was married at the age of 12 in northern India, and sent to live with her in-laws, right? So she didn't get to go to school. She didn't get to really have a childhood. And the only reason I'm here today is because my grandparents didn't want that for their daughters. And my grandfather was actually the one who decided that they would defy cultural norms and send my mother and her sisters to an all-boys school, right? Very difficult decision, tough learning environment. But that decision and that access, and we're coming back to this notion of access, right, is what changed my mother's life and therefore changed my life, right? So access and inclusion to education can have knock-on effects across generations. I think it's really important to say that. A second area I wanted to touch upon was healthcare, right? Injustice in healthcare is really some of the most inhumane and shocking injustices that can be. I think Martin Luther King said that. And still today, we have rural and remote communities that struggle to access just the basic healthcare, maternal healthcare. 60 million kids in the world under the age of 5 are going to die from preventable causes. And this is where technology can play a very, very important role in bridging that gap. We can provide vital services to people who are not able to easily travel to a hospital that might be very far away. You can do video consultations in the field in terms of more advanced services, advanced diagnostics, robot-enabled surgeries, remote monitoring. But really, just the basic technology that we have today, the selfie, right? We can use the selfie for important diagnostics. And I think that's something that we could not have imagined a number of years ago. So there's a lot of potential for the health sector. And the third sector, just quickly, I want to touch upon is financial services, which has been also something that's been discussed a lot in this panel, and of course, in previous panels, and of course, Sandra raised it in terms of remittances and how we can facilitate the cross-border flows of money that way. So, I mean, at the moment, we have 2 billion or so people that don't have access to a formal bank account. And so many adults in the global south don't even have a basic transaction account, so they can't send and receive payments. And that's just a basic. So let alone sort of trying to save money for future crises, for planning, even for building a business. So digital provides you with this platform that can extend the reach of financial services to those in remote communities that don't have a bank, that don't have an ATM. And so this can really boost social inclusion and support poverty reduction. And in particular for women who, the ability to send and receive payments or to save money can really make them more resilient and lift families completely out of poverty. Many people, including many women, were left out of even the social safety programs of the government, simply because they didn't have an account to which the government could send any money. So you know, there's a lot of scope again here for entrepreneurial work in fintech to bridge these sorts of inequalities and boost the livelihoods of people all over the world.
Thank you so much, Lara, because I think this is super interesting that you have been touching on so many key points that we also encouraged the individuals that are taking part to the challenge to explore and reflect upon in their own challenges. When we're talking about gender equality and fintech, for example, is really what your case is all about. And as much as how entrepreneurial tech work can really help in terms of reduction of not accessibility to certain services, as Lara was explaining to us. And Sandra, based on your experience and your angle of expertise, of course, as you were already mentioning on migration, how do you think that tech and generally technical improvement, technology, new tools that can help migrants, both helping them in migration or resettling?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, thanks a lot. And let me start by saying that I agree with Lara's view on the potentials of technology, but also looking or being aware of the risks that it entails. And I mean, technology affects us all already, and so it also affects migration and migrants already. And we can also foster this use of technology to lead it towards sustainable development. And if I look at it a bit more generally, then I think of in terms of increased transparency, cheaper services because they're digital, the access questions that Lara underlined as well. These are some of the questions that are more broad. But if I look at migration specifically, then it means, for example, when migrants and refugees face discrimination, or some might also suffer from trauma, there are, for example, apps with chat boxes that can deliver legal advice or psychological support. Or when migrants, they go on sometimes difficult journeys from home through transit countries to their destination countries. So they're also able to gather information in real time on the security situation, on where to go, etc. These are things that already happen. And also another point are bureaucratic procedures that can become simpler, cheaper, and more transparent. And of course, the point that Lara made in terms of remittances, when migrants send money home to their families, we can make them digital and make sure that they can, for example, use it via mobile phone. And instead of going and waiting for hours in a queue in front of a money transfer operator and then having to take the money cash, and actually, which also can be risky if you have to walk around with a bunch of cash in your pocket. So we can also make this digital. So these are some of the points that we can work on. Always with this also sense that we also have to make sure that we don't do harm while we look for these opportunities of technology.
Thank you very much, Sandra. And Alex, based on your reporting and your focus as well on the African continent and other emerging markets, and you have been covering a lot of stories of entrepreneurs. Have you seen anything that you would like to mention here in terms of like really tech helping with the goal number 10?
Yeah, it's a very good point. I mean, in terms of something I've recently reported on, and really sort of illustrates exactly the points that Lara and Sandra have made, is that there's some things, access to services that we take completely for granted in developed economies. It's just not the same case in many developing nations. And for instance, in a recent article where I spoke to entrepreneurs in Mexico City. Now, of course, entrepreneurs in any Latin American country tend to look across the region in terms of opportunities, and so there's opportunities for that in that sense as an entrepreneur there. But they were saying that basically, infrastructure is insufficient. There's not great public transport. Even something as simple as trying to buy a car. I think it was something as the statistic, if I remember correctly, 4 in every 10 transactions in the used car market ends up in fraud. And you wouldn't expect that in where I'm sat in London in the UK. And so a particular entrepreneur I spoke to was the founder of Kavak, which is a company used car platform based in Mexico City, but also is expanding to lots of different markets. And really their goal is to increase transparency, improve security and access to financial services in the used car market. Because for a lot of people, for instance, in emerging markets in particular, he was talking about Latin America, buying a car can completely revolutionize your life. Suddenly you're able to travel from wherever you live into the city to where your job is. Maybe that increases your opportunities to get other jobs or employment, but just by the very fact that you have a car to be able to travel there. So that's one particular example that stands out. I mean, just to take a slightly different approach as well is, we've looked at specific types of technology, and as Lara said, education, health, financial services, huge, and as Sandra then echoed in terms of migration. But if we look at the technology sector as a whole, there's huge opportunity for job creation. And certainly when I speak to economic developers around the world, whether they're trying to attract foreign companies in the technology sector that are looking for new markets, or they're trying to foster entrepreneurship, technology really holds a whole host of opportunities in terms of job creation, and then in doing so, reducing inequality.
Thank you very much, Alex. And let me just elaborate a bit on this, because Sandra, when we have a few potentially examples that you've seen in your work, I remember in our catch-ups, you were mentioning about the digitalization in the recruitment practices. Just to elaborate a bit more on the job creation, can you mention to the audience what you have seen in your field?
Yeah, happy to do so. In many countries, we have recruitment agencies that help match in the matching process. So people who want to migrate, and the recruitment agencies match the labor market needs, match the demand with the labor market needs in the other country. And these recruitment agencies often have quite some considerable power, and sometimes they also charge migrants significant fees for a job placement. So migrants sometimes even end up in debt bondage, meaning they have to pay back the fee, sometimes for years, or they're even not able to pay back their fee. So in terms of digitalization, what we can use is very concrete examples that we can work on digital platforms for which migrants can give a rating on the recruitment agency. So they can see which recruitment agency is good, which is better, what are the practices they have dealt with, who was treating the migrants in a fair and decent way, etc. So there is kind of a rating by the client, so to speak, that can be done online. I mean, it's something that happens all across the world, but it's something which can also be put for these recruitment agencies. Or, for example, another example is that, for example, in Jordan, we support an oversight authority, and it has set up a digital platform through which labor complaints can be registered. So we can make sure that this platform is also accessible, that it's accessible in several languages through smartphones, etc. So workers, including labor migrants, can actually file complaints if their rights have been violated, and then the oversight authority can act upon it. This is just one example how we can use technology in a project, and technology as a means to an end towards the better rights of migrants and better and fairer recruitment practices.
Thank you very much, Sandra. And in your role, Lara, at the World Bank, have you seen any outstanding examples that you would like to share with entrepreneurs and bright minds that are connected with us today?
Yeah, thanks, Virginia. I actually wanted to pick up on what the other panelists were saying on access, and then now on empowerment, because I think digital technologies, it's great that they're there. But how do we empower people to actually use them? So, having training and literacy initiatives combined with these sorts of tools that say, hey, I can rate my recruiters, I think is extremely important to note. In the work that we're doing at the World Bank, we're looking a lot at regulatory reform, at looking at precisely enhancing access and connectivity, but looking at it from both perspectives, not just the access, but also the actual usage. So I'll give you an example with respect to DFS, right? The Digital Financial Services. If you look at many countries, well, I'll take Bangladesh for an example. The mobile phone ownership has gone up among women, right? But they're not adopting digital services. They're not adopting digital financial services. And there's a lot of factors involved there. It's not just low digital literacy, but it's also aspects like household dynamics and cultural issues. So these are also, let's call them the sort of softer, invisible mile type of policies that need to be thought about. Another thing is that 99% of the digital financial service agents are men. So just a simple policy to think about recruiting more women in these roles, right, would enhance the use, not just access. It's there, they have the mobile phone, but they're not using it. So it's something really important to think about. Another area that, I mean, at least in my work that I've worked on in terms of exactly that, the access and use, is in the health field. So some of my work in terms of my doctoral work was about decision support for assisted living for an aging population. Looking at how can we ensure in an aging population that perhaps doesn't have access to care, can't afford care, maybe fewer people are having children, so you may have fewer extended families. How can we bridge that gap and equalize the access to care through the use of technology? So in that regard, like I developed a living lab on a low-cost system to alert formal and informal caregivers to any risks in the home, like a fall or limited food intake and so on. And so this was a combination of different types of technologies. And it was a while ago, but I think, I won't say how long, but the opportunity for sort of innovation and investment in these areas, I think today is ripe. I mean, it's even bigger than it has been. We have devices like blood sugars, monitors and blood pressure that can instantly send information to doctors and healthcare providers, x-rays that can simply be sent from a rural village to an urban health center, just like that. And what I wanted to point out, because you did say, Virginia, this is really, we want to bring out the tech angle here. And I think for me, why today is a unique opportunity is because we're seeing finally the confluence of three main developments. The first, I would say, is the IoT, the Internet of Things. The second is AI, and the third is big data. So on the one hand, you have IoT that's bringing with it this enormous potential of connecting not only people and smartphones, but all kinds of sensors and devices, right? Big and small. Then you have all of these devices and things are talking to each other all the time. So you've got all this data, this big data revolution where you have vast volumes and types of data. And that's not where it ends, because big data is just big data. It's just raw input. So you need the machine learning and the AI to interpret that complex data and understand human speech, drive cars, play in games. And so for me, that is like where the virtual truly meets the real, right? Where you can map the real world onto the virtual world. And we know that in health, for example, there are hundreds of interacting variables that only machines can really grasp those complex relationships. And that's why image analysis can be used for diagnosis, for example, with tuberculosis, and has been done with great success. And similarly for issues like climate change adaptation and mitigation, image analysis can go a long way. There's a lot of open data. And speaking of regulatory frameworks, here's an area where I think a lot of work needs to be done, and that is to make a lot of this crucial, vital data open, so that people and entrepreneurs can actually access that data, use it, and apply it to the world's problems and trying to achieve the SDGs. So I was working, for example, with a startup looking at crop productivity and farming productivity and trying to optimize farming practices. You have the UN that's looking at how can we predict also migration related flows through AI. And so I think that's that crucial intersection between the real and the virtual now, with the confluence of these technological developments, that I think we could really use to innovate solutions. But again, with the caveat that we have to be careful as this is happening, as we're creating a metaverse, as that's happening. We don't want to exacerbate divides or exacerbate existing biases, and we don't want to leave out a whole bunch of things, because life is not only about statistics. So if you get an AI to analyze your lung x-ray and you say, oh, this person has that, but there are a whole bunch of other things that come into play, like the World Health Organization talks about the social determinants of health. That's not just, what your disease is, what your body looks like, but it's really, where do you live? What's your house like? What's your income? What's your, background? And this is just as important as the mere statistics. So again, the quality of the data we collect is going to lead to much more quality outcomes. So when we try to reduce inequalities, we need to look at how we measure those inequalities as well.
Thank you very much, and thanks for inviting us to be critical thinkers. That I think is what we have been really suggesting since yesterday to our audience, even when we were mentioning the quality education point on the panel. That is, this is not just to make your brain full of information, but it's just to make your brain a bit more working in a better way, in a critical way. So I think, thank you so much, Lara, for giving us the opportunity to really see the double angle of course, what technology can give us in terms of opportunities, but also don't forget what are the kind of, question marks we should put out there when we are using a technology that, as an etymology of a word, is just a tool. That's what is in ancient Greek techne means. So it's like something I need to use. So is our brain, is our being a critical thinker, even you guys now that are working on the challenge, this should be your approach, even when if the question that you received is of course about how tech can help, maybe push out there some of your questions, open questions for the audience as well. Alex, based on your reporting, you have a very interesting perspective on what is happening in the startup ecosystem, Middle East, and specifically in the Turkish arena. Would you like to share it with us, what you have seen?
Sure, absolutely. I'll just build on Lara's point, because I think it's a key that we can't look at technology as like a panacea, as you said earlier, and you always need the caveats. And I'll just use one example before moving on to Turkey. I wrote a big article about questioning this sort of positive narrative around the startup ecosystem. Clearly, lots of potential to create jobs, but what are the unintended consequences on society? And it's unequal in terms of its impact. If we look at some of the platform-based work, for instance, the likes of Uber or ride-hailing platforms, they may be getting they may be criticized in some countries in the West, in big cities. Maybe it's creating traffic issues. There's instability of work. There's not some same labor rights they would get as part of another, more established company. On the flip side, in some developing countries, actually app-based work can pay higher than traditional sectors. So I suppose it's just very important to have that in mind when you look at trying to implement technology. It's not necessarily equal in terms of its impact and potential consequences. On to Turkey, I was there recently, and I wrote a big report on the Turkish economy. And they're certainly, in terms of moving up global value chains, are trying to focus on more tech-based investment. But specifically in their startup ecosystem, there's amazing things happening where there's really inspirational entrepreneurs that have taken the initiative. They've gone ahead and developed things and focused on some areas in which they can really make an impact, even though they may be further behind in terms of established companies or other countries that already have a well-developed entrepreneurial ecosystem. And I see this in Turkey with the mobile gaming ecosystem. There's lots of companies that have emerged there and created lots of opportunities for not only people in some of the major cities like Istanbul, Izmir, and Ankara, but also distributed. The nature of technology, working in the technology sector, is you can be working remotely. So this has given opportunity to software engineers all across the country. And interesting enough, with the difficult economic situation you find in the country, where you've got the lira depreciating, if you're using technology, or you're selling technology into global markets, they're paid in US dollars. So actually, in the face of some economic instability, actually working in the technology sector, going into entrepreneurship can be a key way of making a good income for yourself and then having positive benefits on society.
Thank you very much, Alex. And I know that we have only over 20 minutes left for our panel. And just because Alex was mentioning about the US and being paid in US dollars and not in the currency, we are receiving a lot of very interesting questions from the audience. And I will just direct maybe this question now because of what Alex just mentioned. So Alberto Rodriguez from Spain is asking, it's important to be mentioned that one of the problems is that with the inflation that is happening currently, obviously this will affect Africa. So the African currencies are being affected too, for instance. So he was pushing here an example of the Naira. So what can be done to tackle this? Is maybe crypto a good solution? What do you guys think? Maybe I will leave it to maybe just who wants to start, Lara or Alex or Sandra. Will leave it just open to the panel.
I would say it's a tricky one. I mean, I'm sort of if I were a jury, the jury is still out on crypto from my perspective, so I don't really have much to add on it. I mean, of course, if you're looking in terms of hedges to inflation, clearly that is being used by some global fund managers and investors. I don't think I can add much on the crypto side, so I've probably open up to other panelists on that one.
Lara, I will leave it to you because there was a mention of like, what is the plan of the World Bank? So this might be something directed to you as well.
Yeah, well, I'm being big on the caveats today, but actually, although it says the World Bank, I'm actually a consultant with Rethink the Net, and that's just one of the hats I wear. So I'm not actually representing the World Bank at this event, so I wouldn't be able to comment on that specifically. But I think this is a problem that we're having in terms of well, the overall inequality between countries, right? We're talking about some countries being very much better off, having a lot more power in multilateral organizations, having a lot more power in affecting the stock market. And so that distribution of power is what's leading to these fluctuations and these challenges. In terms of what we can do, I don't know. Again, like Alex, I don't think I would be able to comment on crypto. This is still a gamble. Yes, things are moving, and yes, it's being adopted in many quarters, and you have seen tremendous growth in some of the coins, but we still don't know what the future holds. It will depend a lot on regulation as well in various jurisdictions. But I think in terms of what we can do, if I may just pull aside a little bit on the currency front and focus more on how can we increase economic growth in some of these countries, and look at how can we create a world in which there isn't a set of countries and a small set of countries that's always better off, and there is this other set that is way at the bottom of the totem pole. So how can we shift that? And I think that's all about how we restructure our world and our global economy, right? We want an economy and a world in which nobody's left behind. And this is in everyone's interest, because our world, if the internet didn't prove to us that our world is borderless, clearly the climate crisis and the pandemic have brought that home, right? It's not in our interest to promote inequality and create disparities in access to resources. That's what's dropping GDP and growth and currency. So I think what we need, and this is again speaking to one aspect of the reduced inequality goal 10, and that is what we need is full and empowered participation for every country, no matter what income level they're at, in our global institutions, so that they're empowered to influence decision making and consensus, right? Whether that be consensus on technological standards. So I used to work at the UN in terms of developing standards within the United Nations, the ITU and technology policy standards. And there we had 193 countries at the table. But the more countries would participate in the decision making, the more solid and more resilient our technology standards are, right? So, I mean, we can't continue with global institutions that are one-sided, and I think that's extremely important to raise here in terms of reducing inequalities between countries on a global stage. You need to give you need to create a level playing field and distribute that power and that voice more evenly across the world. And that's how we solve some of these big questions that have been asked by the audience there.
If I may, I'm just going to build on that, Lara, because of course it's among countries that we have inequality, but also within countries, and certainly something I've covered quite intensely when I speak to economic development professionals. How do we spread opportunities to regions outside of the commercial capital, the capital? You know, in the UK, for instance, you know, I think it's more than 40% of all foreign direct investment projects go into the southeast. The disparities are even worse in a lot of other countries, and you know, creating opportunities for people outside of regions can both be done through organic growth in terms of empowering entrepreneurs there on the ground, but also trying to attract companies that may well create opportunities. But it's a good point. It's not just among countries, but it's also within.
And if I can just add one point in that, since I think that's also the beauty of the SDGs overall. We're not talking about the old Millennial Development Goals where we were just focusing on certain countries in the global south, but we're talking about sustainable development goals that are universal, that each country has to fulfill and work towards. So there's also a bigger responsibility sharing in that sense. But of course, the bigger questions that Lara raised in terms of power, these remain, of course. But in that sense, I think from our perspective, it's also key, not only in terms of who has power in terms of the different states, but also like what we always push is a so-called multi-stakeholder approach. We want to make sure that the private sector, that the civil society, that cities and towns, that they're also part of decision-making processes. This goes, of course, beyond our technology, but of course, in technological questions, these kind of approaches also pertain, where we have to see who is actually taking part in decision-making, in standard setting, etc. And for us, it's important that this approach is diverse and that we can make it participatory and inclusive. Back to you, Virginia.
Thank you very much, and thanks for contributing and making this, flowing very nicely. And actually, I would have a question then for the three of you, that is about your optimistic perspective. So what are you more optimistic about in terms of, like, of course, economic development strategy, the different approach that you have been seeing maybe certain governments are taking compared to others, or other developments that you want to mention? Like, what is your kind of uplifting view on this SDG? Lara.
Well, actually, if I may pick up on what Sandra was also talking about in terms of multi-stakeholder participation, I think this is key. And what has given me a bit of hope is I think there is increased awareness of the fact that the status quo is not necessarily working. That what we need to understand is, in many of these global institutions, the rules of the game have been developed and designed by certain powers. And we live in a world in which people who have to participate and who are most affected by the consequences of these decisions are not taking full part in these institutions. So one of the things that I think can be done, and we've seen this in some of the work that I've done in the past, is to rethink to a certain extent the rules of the game through empowered participation on the part of countries that don't traditionally participate in these forums. And that can be done through a number of mechanisms, be it capacity building or sort of sandbox types environments where we can rethink what are the rules actually to develop consensus in some of these institutions. So that would be one thing that I think is important, that we're becoming more and more aware of this. So we have come a long way. We have tackled inequality in a number of areas. What can be seen is that there is more awareness of the implications of our actions. We're looking more and more at ethical and social impact. And, what would make the biggest difference is, I think, and I'm going to be very general here, but I think what we need is greater empathy in our world. I think that our younger generation is actually acutely aware of this, of our interconnectedness, you know, of this delicate balance of nature, the fact that there are gaps that we have to bridge. And you know, lots of young startups are really looking at trying to make an impact in this brave new world and really rethinking the rules of the game, basically, because I don't think we can reverse engineer this. You know, it's a bit like saying, oops, you know, maybe we shouldn't have let Facebook buy Instagram and WhatsApp because of the consequences of this, but that's, you know, it's a bit late. So we need to think in advance of new technological developments. And I think that's what people are doing now, and a lot of the young startups. Not creating technology just for the fun of it, right? But creating tangible solutions to address real world problems. So I think that's what gives me the most hope, is that there is this drive towards more empathy and a real drive as well to understand and measure really the types of inequalities we are looking at. And, you know, in order to solve these problems, we need to first understand what they are. Right? We're not just going to just willy-nilly throw technology at it. At least we should. I don't think we should. We should first identify and measure the problem and then address it.
I totally agree with you. And, you know, just to build a bit on the empathy point, I mean, like Barack Obama said and mentioned so many times that empathy is really a quality of a character that can change the world, and is something that you know, we should not really educate people, but make younger people acknowledge on how they can learn to stand in somebody else's shoes and to see the world through someone else's eyes. And I think this is what really these kind of initiatives are made for. Of course, they are international thanks to technology. We have to say that we can really connect people from any continent, from any time zone, and be here without any barriers of access, of course. And this is what, of course, in your interactivity, in the networking panels as well that we have upcoming for this afternoon, this is maybe something that you should put as your own intention for coming to our panels, is like really how I can learn to see the world from another perspective, as Lara is suggesting, is really, I think our generation, the younger one, specifically then the Gen Z in the audience, will maybe have a bit of better capabilities to do so, because we are now really making, I think, everyone more aware of the importance of empathy. But thank you so much, Lara, for bringing this up. In terms of optimism, Sandra, what you are seeing from your perspective that you can share with us?
Yeah, I think I'm optimistic about two things. One thing is linked to what has been said already, and I think it's what I also think is an increasing number of entrepreneurs who are focusing on positive social impact and who want to work towards the Sustainable Development Goals, which, yes, is why we're also having this panel here. And the second point, what I'm optimistic about, is when I look at my work on migration, is also the migrants themselves, the women migrants, men migrants. When I look at the COVID crisis, the last 2 years, there were lockdowns, there were shutdowns of shops, etc. There were like economic repercussions, and yet the migrants continued to support their families at home through remittances, even increased it in order to make sure that their families at home can survive and have access to the basic needs. So I'm optimistic about the role that migrants can play, and especially also the role women migrants can play, and what we can unleash if we work towards gender equality and towards a bigger empowerment of women. I think these are the two aspects that I think of now.
Thank you very much, Sandra. Alex, based on your reporting, maybe something you would like to share as well as uplifting points.
Sure. I mean, it's been said, so I guess I'm reiterating it. COVID has been a very challenging time. It's completely changed business models across the world, and that in doing so has created a lot of opportunities for entrepreneurs. So I mean, it's heartening to see when you look at research of global entrepreneurship by the likes of the Global Entrepreneurship Monitor. Entrepreneurship is going up in many countries. The perception of entrepreneurship as a route to create societal impact, but also to create an opportunity for yourself is going up in many countries. And I think that I sort of use that as inspiration as entrepreneurs, that there's probably not a better time to be an entrepreneur than today. Also, access to funding in terms of what's happening in the venture capital industry. So I suppose I'm optimistic that there's going to be many more inspiring entrepreneurs doing great things to address the SDGs and reduce, goal 10 in terms of reducing inequality and some of the other areas. So I suppose on the entrepreneurship side, I'm very optimistic, but also from an economic developer perspective, it's heartening because I speak to officials in governments in many countries, and they really are, they have this laser focus, and it's called back to what Sandra said, it's universal in terms of trying to improve the situation, whether it's in country and across borders. So I'm heartened and optimistic that great things will be coming in the coming years.
Thank you very much, Alex. And we really think and hope that among the audience, there are these entrepreneurs that can definitely bring a bit of, change and definitely new innovations that can, change our perspectives or give, a different spin to the answers that we are trying to give to the SDG challenges. We are receiving a few questions from the audience. We have a few remaining minutes. If you're happy to answer, we have Namande that he has been actually putting up here a very clear and straightforward question. The truth is many people in African countries are slow at saving money in the bank since they work for a day's meal or other challenges. So how can this problem be solved in developing countries in terms of, I think this is definitely referring to the saving money point. I don't know who wants to answer and go ahead with this.
Well, I can start. I think that's an excellent question. I think what we're talking about here is financial literacy. I'm working, so as part of my work with Rethink the Net, I mentor companies, and I'm also working with an organization in Africa, actually in Kenya, that just by way of example, ran a literacy drive for young indigenous women in Marsabit. And they found that just having a session with them to talk about what it means to save money, how can that help them? If they understand, if the case is made that there are benefits to understanding how saving money can work and how using it for the benefit of their family can work, it can go a long way. I mean, in fact, I think they started with something like, 200 in terms of the currency value, and were able to save over a period of a few months up to about 800. So it was really something that was shown to be extremely important, and that we're coming back to education. We're coming back to literacy drives. We're coming back to not only, I mean, it's great to have access to technology and all of that, but if you don't know how to use it, what good is it? It's great to have access to money and maybe have $1 a day, but if you don't know how to save it and how to put it aside and use it for the benefit of your livelihood, then that's something that can be done through capacity building programs and the like, and also startups like the one I just mentioned.
Thank you very much. Sandra, you wanted to add something? Yes, please.
Yeah,
go ahead, please.
Thanks a lot. Just one small point to add, and I think it's a very justified question. How can you save money if you're actually struggling to even work every day? And I think this is why, for example, we work on financial inclusion, but we have to combine it also with other measures that we do. One that was mentioned, of course, the financial literacy to understand how things work. But another thing is also, of course, we need to work on the employment side, on economic empowerment. We also need to work on gender equality to make sure that women also have access to jobs, to have access to savings, etc. So it's, I think, a more comprehensive approach that is often needed, and that's why also we have that many SDG goals and not just one.
I think, Virginia, if I may add to that very quickly, of course. I think one big policy reform that's needed in all of it cuts across everything we've been talking about, and that is to allow the rights of workers to organize, because this is something that has been pushed down in many economies, also in the developed world, where labor rights and workers' rights have been neglected for far too long over the last several decades. And so you've seen, for example, CEOs, their salaries going up by 1,000%, and the average worker, you know, maybe 18%. I mean, barely keeping up with inflation. This just cannot stand. You know, we need to find ways to promote workers' rights. I think that is extremely important, and that's how we can increase livelihoods as well.
Thank you very much. Thank you to all of you for really taking part of this panel. And I think what I have been feeling is really your passion for the topic. And I'm really grateful for that. And thanks also for sharing some of your, you know, personal stories and personal points of views. So I need to wrap up this panel. So thank you very much for making us really, with a critical approach, rethinking about reduced inequalities that rightfully, as mentioned before, is one SDG, but as you could see, it's really, you know, encapsulating all the rest of the SDGs that we have been discussing between yesterday and today. And I think it's just, you know, a source of deeper understanding and also, you know, deeper thinking around how we can reduce inequalities, not just across the different countries, but also within one country. That I think has been a really interesting angle to analyze this. So thank you so much, Lara, Sandra, and Alex, for being with me today.